Significant developments have taken place across the Yanchur River on the eastern flank of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions, as Russians have managed to align the front line with the river line from the south near Melenivka to the north near Novoivanivka. Russians have also captured a settlement and pushed the Ukrainians along the second line of defense. In turn, the Ukrainians have managed to counterattack and break through to the rear positions of the Russians on the northern flank of the second line of defense. Taking a closer look, the Russians, however, pushed back in the direction of Zizhneve, where the Ukrainians managed to recapture some fortified positions and push up towards Zizhneve, gaining control over the western parts of the settlement and gaining a foothold within it. The Russians were kicked out of the western parts, being pushed to the eastern outskirts where there's just a single street for the Russian forces. In the near vicinity of the settlements, there are no additional Russian positions. There's the Russian positions within Alexandrorad to the north, Voskresenka to the east, and Meleivka to the southeast, with some fortifications to the southwest and northwest in the vicinity of Novoselivka, where the Ukrainians are flanking the Russian positions from the northern and southern flanks to encircle the Russian forces, who are already operationally encircled. In turn, the Russians continue their operations along the second line of defense, gaining control over additional parts of it. The Russians are securing the flanks for a push towards Oleksivka, where they already have a foothold, as we covered in the earlier update today. The Russians have managed to push upwards towards Oleksivka, reaching towards it and gaining control of it will enable for further offensive operations to the north towards the Vovchi River line and flanking the Ukrainian counterattacks to the northeast. The Ukrainians are launching their operations across the Vovchi River line with a singular road here west of Oristopil, south of the river line, where the nearest logistical hub for the Ukrainians is Pokrovsk. This means that Pokrovsk has two supply lines to the frontline positions there. There is the road towards Mikhailivka, which then goes down south across the river line towards the southern flank of Novoselivka and through the forest patch area towards Novoselivka, as well as towards Lisne as the small town in the north, and then down towards the fortifications north of Novoselivka. Then there's the secondary road down through the highway up towards the settlements, towards Oleksivka, and through the northern flank towards the frontline positions. This means the Russian push towards Oleksivka is aiming to cut off the southern route, and then a push through Sosnivka to regain control of it and up towards the fortifications can cut off the second route, which leaves just the third route along the forest patch area, where the Russians can concentrate their forces and re-establish their positions along the river line, and having the river line as a defensive position to defend against the Ukrainian counterattacks. Combining their forces from Oleksivka in the west and Sosnivka in the east will allow them to secure the southern flank of the Vovchi River line in the vicinity of Velikomuikhailivka. Therefore, we see that the Russians are focusing their efforts along the second line of defense and then up towards the Vovchi River line, while the Ukrainians are attempting to regain control over the positions south of the Vovchi River line along the northern flank of this second defensive line within the Dnipropetrovsk region. The objective is to reverse the situation that the Russians have managed to gain control over these positions through, and that is gaining control over the northern flank, which is the weak point of the fortifications, and then establishing themselves on the flanks of them to regain control of them and cut off the supply lines of the Russian forces. The Russians have two main supply lines to push through the fortifications themselves, and then the southern road through Novomykolaivka. This allows them to supply their forces on the wide section of the front line. As for the eastern flank, they have Shevchenko through Meleivka and up towards Voskresenka, and then on towards Zizhneve, and from Alexandrorad down towards Zizhneve. This is supplied through Komar, and as we can see from this section of the front line, the Russians have the Kurakhove supply line that goes from Donetsk city to Kurakhove onwards towards Konstantinopel, and then onwards towards Komar. That is the road for the Komar supply route through Voskresenka and Alexandrorad. Then there's Velika Novosilka, which goes up towards Komar and to the west to the first line of defense, and then up towards the front line positions. Therefore, we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are somewhat equal in terms of supplies in this section of the front line, and typically that ends in the favor of the Russians. The Russians have also managed to advance here to the south, gaining control over Novohrivka, Gaining full control over this settlement allows them to secure additional positions here in between the northern and southern river line as they continue offensive operations to gain full control over the Yanchu River, which leads up to the second line of defense. Objective of the Russians is to gain control over all of these positions in between the frontline positions and the first and second lines of defense along the Yanchu River as they face off against the Ukrainians who have established the Yanchu River as a defensive line. The Russians have also managed to advance to gain control over Rodynske here along the Yanchu River and control over the eastern parts of Poltavka, the residential area east of the river line along the Yanchu River. So we're seeing the Russians are working to gain full control over the Yanchu River, leaving just the small parts outside of Poltavka, the farm area, and the residential area south of Rodynske along the Yanchu River remaining under Ukrainian control, as well as the fortified positions along the first line of defense. Gaining full control of the Yanchu River will allow the Russians to concentrate their forces in specific points to break through the defenses of the Ukrainians and establish a bridgehead across the river line. They already have control over Melinivka, from which they can advance towards Poltavka in the northern direction. However, that would be facing off against the defensive line from its strongest point. Therefore, the Russians will look to gain additional bridgeheads across, whether directly at the fortifications or to the north of it, to flank it from its weak point. And that is why they want to gain full control over the river line, as it will cover the northern flank for their bridgeheads across the river line, and also widen the area that they potentially can establish a bridgehead across, so they're not forced to push through near Novomykolaivka or Novovasilivske, but they will also have the ability to push through towards Rybne in the north, which is fairly isolated, Uspinivka just outside of Novovasilivske, or even Slahoda further north, which has a river line to the north and a gap between the two sides, which is a weak point along the Yanchu River, which the Russians can take advantage of. Therefore, the Russians are widening and expanding their capacity and capabilities and potential operations to keep the Ukrainians guessing and giving themselves as much of an advantage as possible. The Russians have gained full control over the fortifications along the second line of defense that is connected. This leaves these new isolated points here on the southern flank of Novoalexandrivka. To gain control over these will allow them to flank Vishneve, which has the next 2 points of the fortifications along the second line of defense, and this will allow them to then push onwards in the northern direction towards the remaining fortifications along the highway. The Russians are now fairly close to the highway to cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and Huliaipole, which is one of the main supply lines for Huliaipole, which is a frontline logistical hub for Ukrainian forces in the south. Moving on to the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians consider offensive operations within Rodynske, where they are restarting their operations to gain full control over the city. Rodynske is split into 2 parts. There's the apartment complex area and the residential area. The apartment complex area spans from the southern outskirts and eastern outskirts of the city up through the central parts. This allows the Ukrainians to have a strong defensive position within Rodynske and gives Rodynske the 10,000 pre-war population number. Then there's the northern residential area. The Russians currently have all of their positions within the northern residential area. Then there's the industrial area to the west of the city and residential area in the southern parts of the city connected to Chervony Liman. The Russians are currently storming Rodynske head-on to gain a foothold within the residential area and push into the outskirts of the apartment complex area, where they're working on gaining a foothold within their first apartment complexes. This is to gain a proper foothold within the city and start pushing through the apartment complex areas. Gaining full control over Rodynske will completely cut off the northern highway leading into Pokrovsk. The Russians restarting the offensive operations towards Rodynske shows that they are not worried about the Ukrainian counterattack any longer. With the recent recapture of Nikhanorivka, the supply line has been cut for their forces west of Boykivka, and with the operations towards Volodymyrivka, it shows that they have the power to start offensive operations on the flanks, to secure the flanks, allowing them to concentrate on the important position, which is Rodynske, which will cut off the northern highway and significantly limit the supplies the Ukrainians have available for the defense of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad. This, combined with the recent operations by the Russians to storm the coal mine on the western flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians are clearly aiming to cut off the final 2 highways leading into Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, which will leave the cities operationally encircled. Further north in the northern section of the front line, the Russians continue offensive operations within Kamyanka, where they have started storming the trenches and fortifications here on the northwestern flank of the town. Russians are looking to gain full control over the fortifications, which will secure the supply route in the northwestern direction, and to kick out the final Ukrainian positions within the settlement. Gaining full control over Kamyanka establishes yet another logistical hub for the Russian forces on the western bank of the Uskar River line. Finally, in the Sumy region, the Ukrainians have managed to regain control over some positions in the southern outskirts of Oleksivka, storming the settlement itself. They managed to gain control over the forest line to the southwest and a foothold in the first residential buildings. The Ukrainians started to storm Oleksivka directly head-on as the operations to regain control over Vereshchina and then flank the town of Oleksivka by storming Novomykolaivka and cutting off the supply routes. Encircling the town will allow them to quickly regain control over Oleksivka with minimal casualties. However, their attempts to flank Oleksivka and gain control of the supply lines failed, and this led to their new operations to storm it directly head-on. They have managed to recapture Vereshchina twice and then push onwards towards Novomykolaivka. Both times they failed, and the Russians managed to recapture the positions, leaving Vereshchina in the gray zone as a death zone where neither side can establish possessions because all of the buildings have been destroyed from the artillery and FAB strikes, which leaves us with the current situation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.